One of my modern-day heroes is a man by the name of Tim Keller, a pastor who died just a few years ago. In the 1980s, Tim Keller was a professor at a seminary in Philadelphia, but he became convinced that there needed to be a new church planted in New York City, and he was looking everywhere to find a pastor who would be willing to do that job, and to his frustration, he could get no takers. And for probably good reason. New York City was known as the place where churches go to die. It's a place where you have wealthy and poor, but none of the middle class that oftentimes helps a church start. And it's a place of cynics and critics and people who feel cold to the gospel. But he became so convinced that this was an important thing to do that eventually, somewhat almost begrudgingly, he decided that if no one else would do it, then maybe he was the one called to do it himself. He concluded that not because he was sure that he would be capable of it, but he decided to take that step because he believed to not do so would have been a lack of trusting in God, who had put this so clearly upon his heart. So he prayed, his wife prayed, he asked for many other people to pray, and he moved into New York City. And what happened next is genuinely extraordinary. The church that was planted, Redeemer, was not just a church that did fine, which would be extraordinary in of itself, but it's a church that flourished, eventually becoming a church of thousands, many of whom were skeptics and new believers. And not only, in fact, did this church do so well, but it became the beginning, in some ways, of an urban church planting movement that continues even now. And about 10 years into this time in New York City, Tim Keller reflects on what he sees as an important moment in at least his life, and also in some ways in the life of the church. And it was a moment where things were really bleak. This was right after 9/11 had happened, and you can imagine how in New York City, he said there was just a depression that just fell upon everyone. And recently, his wife, Kathy, had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and they were still trying to understand and navigate that challenge, only then to find out that he himself, roughly at my age at that time, was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And so in that time, at some evening, Kathy Keller talks to Tim, and here's how Tim recalls the conversation. She says to him, "Imagine you were diagnosed with such a lethal condition that the doctor told you that you would die within hours unless you took a particular medicine, a pill, every night before going to sleep. Imagine that you were told that you could never miss it or you would die. Would you forget? Would you not get around to it on some nights? No, it would be so crucial that you wouldn't forget, you would never miss." And then Kathy goes on to say, "Well, if we don't pray together to God, we are not going to make it because of all that we are facing. I am certainly not. We have to pray." And Keller looks back on that as an important moment because he says Kathy was right. We would not have survived. We were not going to survive with the mission that we were called to do unless we depended upon God and prayer. And though he did not quote Paul here, he could have, because I think we see something very similar at the conclusion of the passage that Dave just read for us, at the conclusions of Ephesians, where Paul, the last thing he asks for is prayer. He says, verse 19, "Pray also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak." That's an extraordinary statement if we just sit with it for a moment. I mean, I told you how I'm impressed with Tim Keller, and I am, but I mean, if we're talking about the guy, it's Paul, right? I mean, apart from Jesus, Paul is the one who probably has the claim to being the greatest evangelist this world has seen. He doesn't just start a cool church in one city. He goes from one city to another city to another city, starting church after church, and not in places where people generally kind of know the gospel. This is a place where no one has ever even heard of Jesus. And not only that, where there's this deep resistance, where Jewish leaders and synagogues are seeking to have him imprisoned, and he becomes imprisoned. He's beaten. He has all sorts of things happen to him, and yet he continues to speak about the gospel. Sometimes in trials, he decides to use this as an evangelistic moment to speak to all who are there. Talk about a man who is bold. And yet he says, "Please pray for me. I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm in chains right now. I know I'm supposed to be bold, but I'm afraid I'm not going to be. I need help to be able to have the right words, to be able to speak with the right confidence. Without prayer, I'm not sure I'm going to survive. And I think he says that at the very end of Ephesians 1, of course, just because he genuinely means it. He genuinely wants the Ephesian church to partner with him by praying for him. But also because he's setting an example. Because what he thinks is true of himself, he also believes is true of us. For we, like Tim and Kathy Keller, like Paul, are called to a mission that is so great and so difficult that without the work of God brought about through prayer, we will not make it. So this morning I want us to just kind of consider two things about that. Why it is that you and I need to pray, and that will take much of the time. And then how it is that we are supposed to pray. Why it is that we need to pray. My goal in this is just to convince us, man, I need to pray more. And perhaps you already have been convinced if you were with us last week. Because if you were with us last week, you might remember how what we just heard in the passage we talked about, how you and I, if you are a follower of Jesus, we are engaged in a battle. And last week we especially considered who this battle is against, that we are facing a foe who is menacing, who is powerful, and who is seeking to destroy us, Satan and his forces. And Luther, we quoted, was right. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. We are not strong enough to withstand the attacks. But Paul says you don't need to be. Be strengthened in the Lord is what he said. And that's what that whole spiritual armor that he invited us to put on, the armor of God. It's a way of saying find your strength in God, in the gospel. And he goes on, as we just heard, to speak not just about putting on the armor, but about praying. Pray at all times in the Spirit. He's not changing his topic right there. He is basically telling us, here's what it means to be strengthened in God. Here's how you put on the armor. If you need strength, and you do, you need to pray. And it's not just, as we said last week, because of the strength of the opponent, but it's also because of the greatness of the mission to which we have been called. That we are called to a mission as great as the one that I spoke of with the Kellers and with Paul. That is our mission as well. And that requires strength that only God can provide. And I wonder if having just said that, if there feels like a little bit of a disconnect. Because Paul's life is different from ours, right? None of us are going to be the first missionary throughout the Roman Empire. I think that's safe to say. And honestly, none of us, or maybe few of us, are likely to ever be involved in an endeavor quite like what Tim Keller had to do, starting a new urban church in a place that seemed hostile. So it's understandable to us why they would say, boy, do I need prayer, because the work that I'm called to do is so hard. But that feels different from us. I mean, for us, most of life is just getting our kids to their soccer practice on time and just making sure that we don't forget to pay the bills and just kind of doing one thing after the other. Is it really the case that we are involved in the same thing that they are? And Paul says, yes. Yes, if you are a follower of Jesus, you share with me in this extraordinary calling. Which maybe seems a little confusing if you just focus on the initial instructions that we have in our passage. Perhaps you notice that when Paul is talking about the battle, he keeps on talking about standing. After having done everything to stand. And if we hear just that repeated word of stand, we might misunderstand Paul to be saying that our job is to protect ourselves. That we need just kind of to go on the defense. That Jesus has conquered, that Jesus has won, he has given us salvation, and now we just need to hold our ground until Jesus comes back to rescue the rest of things. And I bring that up because actually I think it's not uncommon for churches to start thinking that way. To think that our primary responsibility is on the defensive, that the world is dangerous, that we are under attack, and that what you and I most need to do is to protect ourselves, to hold our faith together, to hold the faith of our family together. We need to put a moat around the castle. We need to reinforce the bunkers. We need to hide in the basement till the tornado storm warning is over, and then you can come out when it's all safe. We need just to stand. But when Paul is talking about standing, that's not actually what he has in mind. The point of standing is not that you're not to be moving forward. The point is that you're not to be taken down. He says you're in hand-to-hand combat. He uses this language of wrestling. Satan, whatever you are doing, is trying to bring you to the ground, and your goal is to make sure you're the last one standing. It's not talking about offense or defense. It's talking about an attack. And if we want to know the kind of battle that Paul has in mind, we only need to kind of expand our view and think about all that he has said throughout Ephesians. Chapter 2, you might remember, after talking about how through the gospel we have been brought to God, he says, now we have been renewed, recreated, created in Christ Jesus for good works. And then he goes on to talk about that kind of good work. And it's not just temple maintaining or temple protecting. You are now part of the work of temple building. There is something dynamic that you are a part of, Paul says. Something so dynamic that he says the demons will look and admire God when they watch what is happening. Similarly, in chapter 5, when he speaks about what has happened to us, the change that has happened within us, he says, now you are children of light. And he doesn't go on to say, therefore, stay in the light and make sure you stay completely out of the darkness. No, it's more than that. He says, move into the darkness, invade the darkness, expose it with light, that those who are in the darkness may be brought to light. He's calling us to move on the offensive. See, Paul is saying, I'm not the only one who is called to speak boldly. I'm not the only one who is called to bear witness. You as well are in that calling together. And if we need more evidence of that, it's very present even in the very armor that Paul speaks about. Specifically when he talks about our feet. Verse 15, when he's talking about how we should arm ourselves with the strength of the armor of God, he says, as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Now, just like often in the spiritual armor, Paul here is speaking in a way that is alluding to something that's going on in the prophet Isaiah. So in Isaiah chapter 51, you have this moment where Israel, God's people, are held captive. They are in exile in foreign cities under a tyrant, and God looks down on his people with compassion, and he decides that he is going to save his people. So metaphorically, we're meant to imagine God leading his army of angels and attack the enemy army, and he defeats them, and now the people are freed. They can go home, except they don't yet know it. That they're still in their cities. They don't realize that the soldiers are gone, and at any point they can go free. And so what does God do? He takes the soldier and he sends the soldier, says, go, tell them that the victory is won. Tell them that they are set free. And so Isaiah speaks of it in these famous words, Isaiah 52:7, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. And we can imagine what's being depicted here. A man who's just been running down the mountain, and he kind of charges into the city, and he says, God has won. God has won. Your enemy is defeated. You can go home now. And these people kind of like coming out of the doors, and their comprehension is slowly dawning to understand that everything has changed. And the passage goes on to speak about how this messenger says, now depart, leave, go back to the city, go back to God. Now, do you see what Paul is doing when he's talking about the armor? Again, what is the armor that we are supposed to put on our feet? As shoes for your feet, how lovely are the feet of those, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Do you see what he's saying? You and I, we, the body of Christ, the church of God, we are that messenger. The victory has been won. Jesus, the very warrior of God, has conquered sin and Satan on the cross. And now captivity is over for all who hear the good news. It's just that people need to hear about it, and we're the ones who are sent out, and we're supposed to say, God has won. Your God reigns. Victory has been achieved. See, this is not get in the bunker and be safe for a while. This is move on the offensive and declare the good news. It is daunting, but it is awesome. I have a friend who is an eye doctor, and he has spoken about how one of his most extraordinary experiences was going on a missions trip and literally restoring sight to the blind. Like through the procedures that he'd been gifted with, being able to take people who for years had not been able to see and seeing their eyes open, and for the first time in years, them being able to see their loved ones. I mean, how cool would that be to be able to see that happen at your hands, right? You and I actually have an even greater privilege that we can be a part of, to see people who are set free from sin and death. Do you see how awful, how deeply awful sin is? I know I'm a pastor, I'm supposed to say that, but it's also one of those things that the more that you experience in life, the more you see just how true it is. If you've ever experienced someone who has been who's been experiencing addiction, or someone who is just kind of in the thrall of self-destructive behavior, you know what I'm talking about. Or if you've seen what abuse can do to a family, and not just one generation, but how it can be passed from one generation to behaviors to the next generation. Or if you see what poverty can do and how it can wreak havoc on people, or if you've seen anything about the terrors of war, sin is just awful. And its final statement is death. There is nothing worse. There really is nothing worse once we understand what it is. And there is nothing that you and I can do about it except one thing. There is one thing that has the answer for sin, that has the power to disarm the power of sin, and that is the news that God has won. That Jesus has overcome death and has taken away our sin, that the captives now can go free. That word has power. It has power to free people from their own shame and bring them into freedom, to bring people out of lies into the truth. That word that Christ has won is able to make what was once crooked straight again. It's able to heal generation upon generation because it's bringing people out of captivity to something that's awful into a relationship with God. And that word is the word that you and I are given to go and run and declare. God is saying here are your shoes, put them on, be ready, and go. Let people who right now are tortured under the tyrant of sin know that I have won, that they don't need to be captive anymore, that it's time for them to depart and come back to God. What a glorious calling we have been given. It is the same calling that Tim and Kathy Keller felt. It's the same calling that Paul feels. You and I are meant to join that glorious calling of mission to be the messenger to the world. And I say you and I, or probably better put we, because that's also an important piece of this. I think sometimes when we talk about speaking of the gospel, evangelism, part of the reason we get overwhelmed is we think that we're supposed to have all the gifts on our own. We think of it individualistically. That you and I, each of us, are supposed to be really good at talking to people we don't know very well, really good at inviting people to things that we feel a little bit afraid to invite people to, really good at also hosting those things and having gifts of hospitality, really good at being able to talk about the gospel well and answer really difficult questions about people's doubts, and then also really good at helping nurture young Christians. We're supposed to have all the gifts, which is ridiculous, right? No wonder we feel overwhelmed by it. But that's not how God calls us. We are the body of Christ. Collectively, we are putting on the shoes. Each of us are given a different role. Some of us are really good at speaking to the newcomers and saying, hey, come along. Others of us are really good at setting this incredible spread so that people feel welcomed at a place. Others of us go, hey, if you can just give me a conversation, I love to talk to them about Jesus. I'd love to answer some questions. Others of us are great at praying or walking alongside. Collectively, when we recognize this is what we're meant to do together, that's how we're supposed to do it. And yet, as encouraging I think as that note is, it still, if we're honest, is daunting. Because we can't do it, right? If we're honest, this actual task of going and speaking about the news of Jesus in such a way that people can hear it, it's just too much. And if you're feeling that way at all right now, then you are exactly where Paul is when he is saying things at the end of this passage. Pray for me. Pray that I might have the words. Pray that I might be bold. I know I'm supposed to be, because he knows something that we sometimes forget, and that is there is an enemy who is seeking to thwart us. As we are running to the cities to declare the news of freedom, he is lurking in the shadows, seeking to bring us down and to stop us. And we cannot withstand that apart from the strength of God. And so Paul says, pray. Pray at all times in the Spirit, because the calling that you've been given requires the strength of God. So we've spoken of why we need to pray. Now, briefly, and we'll only be able to touch on it briefly right now, let's talk about how we're supposed to pray. I'm saying briefly right now because we're almost out of time, but we're going to be spending next week more time thinking about what it means to pray in the way that God is calling us to, the way that Paul instructs us to here. This morning, I just want to focus on two aspects of this instruction where Paul says, pray at all times in the Spirit. That this, he says, is the way that we find the strength from God that we need for mission. Two things. Pray at all times. In other words, as we learn to pray, we need to pray dependently. Perhaps you noticed in verse 18, where we get most of these instructions about praying, that there's one word that's just used a lot, and that's all. Praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. The idea here is that it's utterly comprehensive. In other words, there is no corner of our lives that does not need prayer. There is no aspect of our existence where we can go, thanks God, I've got this one from here. Everything needs prayer. There is not anything that is too small for us to pray about, and there is nothing that is too little for us that we don't need to depend upon God. But Paul's point here is learn to depend upon God for everything. Which, practically speaking, I think means we need to kind of learn habits, ways of kind of reminding ourselves of regularly coming before God in prayer. Tim Keller, in the same book that I was alluding to before, says for him, he started by just having a time of prayer in the morning. He's realized for him that was not enough. He found that for him, he needed to begin and end the day in a time of prayer, because it was only that way of framing that he was beginning to be able to recognize, okay, I am depending upon God in all things. And there's no rule for this, right? Different people can learn to pray in different ways. The key is that we need strength from God in all things, so we need to be able to learn to depend on God in everything. Speaking in practical terms, I also love how honest Paul is when he's talking about learning this way of dependence. Notice he talks about keeping alert in prayer with all perseverance, which of course means that sometimes when we're praying, we won't see any immediate payoff. Sometimes when we're praying, it will feel like we're speaking to a brick wall and we feel like nothing is happening. Sometimes God waits. I think God waits because he is teaching us dependence. But Paul says, don't be confused. Keep going. Persevere. God hears. Speaking personally, and I wonder if some of you have experienced this as well, there are times I can think of where there was something that I was just praying for regularly, and at a certain point, I almost kind of stopped believing that my prayers would ever make a difference, but I kept praying. And I almost kind of forgot that I was still praying about it. And then something happens where it's like this shaft of light breaks through. And I see God clearly has been hearing. And he answers something that maybe I even forgot that I've been praying about. In those moments when we've been kind of waiting and persevering, those moments especially, I think we see the kindness of God. And we learn to depend on God more deeply through that. We find our strength from God through praying dependently. And that is how we can continue on mission. Secondly, I think we're called to pray as a child who is loved by his Father. Where do I see that? Well, Paul says, at all times praying in the Spirit. In the Spirit is Paul's way of speaking, being influenced by the Spirit, and it frequently is contrasted with being influenced by the flesh, by our own instincts, our own way of seeing things. Our natural tendency when we're before God is to think that we need to impress God, is to think that God probably is relatively grumpy with us, and we need to be able to say just the right words in just the right way to be able to get God to do just what we want him to do. But the Spirit actually leads us in a different direction. Paul actually speaks elsewhere in Romans about how the Spirit helps us when we pray. And here's what he says the Spirit does. He teaches us to say, Abba, Father, as we are praying. That's a word of intimacy, to come knowing that we have a God who smiles on us as we draw near to him. So praying in the Spirit means learning to pray not as a slave who's trying to placate a master, or not as a dignitary who is trying to persuade a mighty king, but as a child who is crawling up into his father's lap and just asking him for something. When we learn to pray in that way, our prayers change. Speaking again practically, I found that it's so counterintuitive for me to believe that the God of the universe is that welcoming to me that I kind of need to begin my prayers often in that way. That's one of the reasons I think Jesus tells us to start by praying Father. And I find for me, sometimes I just need to kind of, in God's presence, remind myself and say, Lord, I realize that you have told me to come, even though it doesn't feel intuitive right now, that you actually are smiling upon me, even though it doesn't feel like that. Sometimes we need to lean into that. And I think as we learn to pray in this fashion, our prayers do, as I said, change. We learn that our prayers don't need to be flowery or complicated or have a lot of repetition. We can just ask simply. And similarly, in the way that we see in the Psalms, we learn that we don't have to pray in language that feels appropriate. We can pray with honesty, bringing whoever we are and whatever is on our heart to our Father, knowing that he hears us in love. It's as we do that we find ourselves more and more turning to our God and leaning on him and depending on him and gaining strength. And that is how we are strengthened for mission. You know, I find that as a preacher, there are a few things I know when I'm speaking about. These will be the things that will make people feel overwhelmed or inadequate. I mean, there's obviously the obvious topics, like you can talk about sex, you can talk about money, those things we feel guilt about. But I actually find that two of the things that we feel the most inadequacy about are the two things that we've just been talking about evangelism and about prayer. And I don't think that's an accident. When we're talking about the resistance of the evil one, I think we're seeing it play in this very thing. He wants to thwart us in these two areas where our power is to be found. I also think it's really important for us to learn to talk about both of these together. Because as we gain a sense of God's great call upon us and the vastness of the mission and the glory of the mission we've been given, man, does it lead us to want to pray more. And as we learn to pray, and as we learn to depend on God, we slowly find ourselves growing in confidence and strength for the mission to which we are called. I believe Kathy Keller was right, not just for what she said about her and Tim, but what she would be implicitly saying about us as Trinity Western Springs. If we are to be faithful with the calling that we have been given to declare the news that our God reigns to Western Springs and the community around us, we will only be able to do this through prayer. We cannot do it apart from that. We need to be a church that prays. That, of course, is the negative way of saying, but we won't survive without it. But there's another way of speaking about it that is also true. It's the way that Paul says at the end of his prayer in Ephesians 3, he says, to him who is able to do abundantly more than all that we can ask or imagine. We have a God who, as he hears prayer, does abundantly more than we might ask or even that our brains can conceive of. Who knows what God might do through us, people who in ourselves are inadequate, through this church, as we find our strength in God and seek to be faithful to him? I don't know, but I would love to find out. And so we need to pray. And let's do that even now. Let's come now before God, acknowledging our inadequacy, naming our guilt, moving into the light, and also asking God for help to fulfill the calling that he has given us. Let's spend a couple minutes in silent prayer, and I'll lead us in prayer in a couple minutes' time.